October 1000 CE, and the North Atlantic is restless, a cold, iron-colored expanse that rises and falls like a living thing. And at the prow of a long ship cutting through the mist stands a man named Leif Erikson, his hands stiff with cold, his cloak soaked with salt spray, his eyes fixed not on glory, but on survival. Because this voyage was never meant to make history, it was meant to solve a problem born far to the east in the crowded fjords of Norway, where land was scarce and kings were growing powerful, and carried westward through Iceland, where feuds could end families in a single night, and further still to Greenland, a place so harsh that every winter felt like a verdict. And now, after weeks of open sea, after trusting their lives to wind, memory, and the narrow shape of a wooden hull, land is rising from the fog ahead of them, dark and forested and utterly unlike anything they have ever known. And Leif Erikson does not shout or raise his arms or claim it in the name of a king, because he understands something that later explorers will learn too late, that reaching land does not mean conquering it, and discovery does not mean safety. He is the son of Erik the Red, an outlaw who founded Greenland not out of ambition, but because violence had closed every other door. And Leif has inherited that same uneasy legacy, a life shaped by exile, by the understanding that the Norse world expands not because it wants to, but because it must, because every place it settles eventually pushes back. And so when the keel grinds softly into sand and the ship comes to rest on a foreign shore, this moment that history will later dress in triumph feels instead like a pause, a breath held too long. Because the men behind Leif, farmers' sons and sailors and craftsmen, are staring inland at forests so thick they seem to swallow the light, at a land that feels alive in a way Greenland never was, and abundance they know instinctively can be as dangerous as scarcity. These men have come west chasing a rumor, carried years earlier by another exile, Bjarni Herjolfsson, who glimpsed land beyond Greenland but never set foot upon it. And in that rumor lay hope, timber for ships, grass for animals, soil that did not fight back against the plow, a place the sagas will later call Vinland, a name that promises warmth and plenty, but names are easy and staying alive is not. Europe, at the turn of the first millennium, is not an empire reaching outward, it is a fractured world of small kingdoms and fragile faith. And the Norse are not conquerors marching under banners, they are survivors pushing against the limits of geography, moving west in reluctant stages, from Norway to the Faroes, from the Faroes to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, each jump longer, riskier, more isolating than the last. And every settlement balanced on the edge of collapse, dependent on trade routes that can vanish with a single storm, on animals that can die in a single winter, on ships that must be rebuilt again and again because iron is precious and wood is scarce. Greenland itself, founded around 985 CE, survives only through walrus ivory and seal hunting, through stubbornness and luck, and Leif grows up knowing that one failed season can erase a community entirely. So when he steps onto this new shore in North America, he does not see destiny, he sees a question, one that will define everything that follows. Can this land sustain them without destroying them? The work begins immediately, because hesitation is dangerous. Ships are unloaded, tools unpacked, turf and timber shelters raised low against the wind, familiar shapes transplanted into an unfamiliar world, and fires are lit not for comfort, but for control, for the illusion that this place can be made predictable. And at Meadows, on the northern edge of what we now call Newfoundland, Europe plants a fragile temporary footprint, not a colony meant to grow, but a base, a probing hand reaching into a continent that does not yet know it is being touched. Timber is everywhere, straight and strong, a treasure beyond measure for men used to counting every plank. Rivers run thick with fish, game moves through the forests without fear, and for a brief moment the land seems to confirm the stories, to reward the risk. But even in abundance there is tension, because the Norse are not alone, and they sense it before they see it, in traces left behind, in patterns that do not belong to animals, in the quiet awareness that this land has its own history, stretching back thousands of years. And when contact finally comes, cautious and uncertain, it is shaped by misunderstanding from the very first moment. The sagas will later call these people Skraelings, a word heavy with fear and distance, but they are indigenous peoples who know this land intimately, who move through it in ease, who see the Norse not as heroes from legend, but as strangers from the sea, armed with iron and arrogance and need. And the imbalance is immediate and fatal, because while the Norse possess weapons and ships, the people of this land possess numbers, knowledge, and the patience of those who belong where they stand. Leif Erikson moves carefully, trading when he can, avoiding unnecessary violence, aware that a single misstep here, so far from any help, could mean annihilation. But the tension does not fade, it deepens, because this is not a meeting of equals with shared expectations, it is a collision of worlds separated by an ocean of experience. And beneath every exchange lies the question of who will bend first. As autumn deepens and the days shorten, the reality of distance settles in. There will be no reinforcements if this fails, no second chances delivered by the next tide, and Leif understands, perhaps more clearly than any man who will follow him, that Vinland is not empty, not waiting, not eager to be claimed. It tolerates presence only briefly, and as the wind shifts and winter whispers at the edges of the camp, the greatest decision of this entire voyage begins to take shape. Not whether the Vikings can fight here, not whether they can build here, but whether they can stay here without losing everything they have left. Because reaching America was the easy part, and the silence that will follow, the silence of abandonment and forgetting, will be far harder to endure. And in that silence lies the true beginning of this story.
The ships do not vanish from Vinland in a single final departure, because history is rarely that clean. And the Norse do not abandon possibility all at once. They circle it, return to it, test it again. And so the story continues not with silence, but with hesitation, with voyages that follow in Leif Erikson's wake, driven by men who believe that what failed once might succeed under different hands. And among them is Thorfinn Karlsefni, a man of wealth, ambition, and reputation, who arrives in Greenland years later, carrying something Leif did not bring to Vinland in sufficient measure: families, livestock, and the intention to stay. Karlsefni is not motivated by desperation alone, but by calculation, by the belief that Vinland's failure was not inevitable, only premature, and that with enough people, enough women and children, enough supplies, a true colony might take root where a seasonal outpost could not. Around 1010 CE, ships once again push westward from Greenland, their holds packed not just with tools and weapons, but with hope made heavier by responsibility, because this time retreat will not be simple. This time, lives beyond fighting men are at stake. When Karlsefni's expedition reaches Vinland, the land appears unchanged, forests still dense, rivers still alive with fish, but the atmosphere is different, because permanence alters perception, and what once felt like opportunity now feels like a challenge demanding submission. Turf houses rise again, larger and more numerous. Animals are unloaded, routines established not for months but for years, and for the first time, Europe attempts not merely to touch North America, but to live within it. Children cry in the night, women tend fires and food, and in those ordinary sounds lies a radical shift, because a settlement with families is no longer an experiment, it is a statement, and statements invite response. Contact with the indigenous peoples becomes more frequent, more complex, and more strained, because trade that once occurred between cautious strangers now unfolds in the shadow of visible expansion, of cleared land, of animals grazing where none did before, and the Norse, perhaps without realizing it, begin to signal intent, not just presence. The sagas speak of exchanges of red cloth for furs, of fascination with iron weapons, of moments where curiosity outweighs fear, But they also speak of tension escalating with terrifying speed, of a single incident, whether a misunderstanding, an act of aggression, or a perceived insult, unraveling months of fragile coexistence. And in that unraveling, the limits of Norse power become brutally clear. When violence erupts, it does not follow the patterns the Vikings know. There is no open field, no clear enemy line, no decisive clash. Instead, there are sudden attacks, retreat into forests, reappearances from directions that defy expectation. And the Norse find themselves fighting not just people, but terrain itself, a terrain that absorbs their movements and conceals their opponents. Iron weapons cut, shields hold, courage does not fail, and yet none of it produces dominance, because dominance requires control, and control here is impossible. Numbers matter, and the Norse are few, isolated by an ocean that makes reinforcement a fantasy rather than a plan, and every skirmish carries a cost that cannot be replaced. Karlsefni, for all his ambition, is not blind, and as weeks turn into months and months into a second winter, the calculation shifts again, because this is no longer about whether Vinland can provide resources, it is about whether it can be defended without bleeding the Norse world dry. Greenland cannot spare men indefinitely. Iceland will not send families into a land already marked by conflict, and Norway, turning inward under growing royal authority and Christian consolidation, has no interest in sustaining a distant colony that offers no immediate return. The Norse are discovering a truth that later empires will also learn at great cost. Arrival is not expansion, and presence does not equal power. The indigenous peoples of Vinland, fighting not for opportunity but for continuity, for land that is already theirs, do not need to win a decisive victory. They only need to make settlement costly enough that it becomes irrational. And slowly, relentlessly, that is exactly what happens. The Norse begin to fortify, to limit movement, to fear the forest that once promised abundance. And in that fear, the dream of Vinland begins to shrink, transforming from a future home into a contested extraction zone, valuable only for what can be taken quickly and safely. Timber is cut and stockpiled, not for building outward, but for transport back east, proof of value without the burden of occupation. And this quiet pivot marks the true end of the Viking dream in North America, because a land that cannot be held must be exploited briefly and then left behind. When the final decision is made, it is not marked by ceremony, only by exhaustion, by the recognition that no amount of courage can substitute for numbers, supply lines, and legitimacy in a land that does not recognize Norse claims. Families are loaded back onto ships, animals slaughtered or abandoned, houses left to collapse back into earth, and with that withdrawal, Europe's first sustained attempt to colonize the Americas dissolves not in defeat, but in pragmatism. The Norse return east carrying timber, stories, and a hard-earned understanding that Vinland exists, that it is rich, and that it is not theirs. And that understanding spreads quietly through Greenland and Iceland, stripping the West of its mythic pull, because opportunity without security is not opportunity at all. Over time, voyages to Vinland become rarer, then symbolic, then forgotten, and as decades pass, the Atlantic closes again, not physically, but culturally, as Europe turns its attention inward, reshaped by Christianity, kingship, and the slow tightening of medieval structures that leave little room for distant experiments. Vinland fades not because it was impossible, but because it demanded a scale of commitment the Norse world could not provide. And in that failure lies one of history's most revealing silences, a moment when two worlds touched and then withdrew, leaving no conquest, no empire, only traces in soil and story. And as the sagas preserve echoes of these journeys in words that grow more symbolic with each generation, the reality beneath them hardens into truth. The Vikings did not fail because they were weak. They failed because America was already strong, already claimed, already defended by people who had no reason to leave. And in choosing withdrawal over annihilation, the Norse made a decision that erased them from this continent for nearly 5 centuries, ensuring that when Europe returned again, it would do so under very different circumstances, with very different consequences, and with no memory of how close it had once come and how deliberately it had turned away.
Winter tightens its grip on Vinland slowly at first, almost politely, as if the land itself is watching these strangers from across the sea and deciding how much it will tolerate. And Leif Erikson feels the shift before snow ever falls, in the way the wind cuts sharper through the trees, in the longer shadows creeping across the turf walls of the settlement at Meadows, and in the growing silence between encounters, because contact with the people of this land has become cautious, irregular, and charged with an unease that no trade can dissolve. And as days shorten and nights stretch endlessly, the Norse discover what every culture learns too late when stepping onto foreign soil. Abundance in summer does not guarantee survival in winter. Food must be preserved, shelters reinforced, ships protected from ice and storms, and all of it must be done far from home, far from kin, far from the fragile networks that make Norse life possible. And for the first time since Landfall, the question shifts from possibility to endurance. The men work constantly, repairing hulls, shaping timber, storing dried fish and meat, but beneath the rhythm of labor is a growing awareness that this settlement is not Greenland, where isolation is brutal but familiar, nor Iceland, where law and kinship still bind communities together. This place is something else entirely, a land that does not share their seasons, their customs, or their understanding of ownership. And that difference becomes most dangerous when it intersects with fear. The sagas will later describe early exchanges with the indigenous people as cautious but workable, cloth traded for furs, milk for skins. But archaeology and logic suggest a far more fragile balance, because trade without shared language is a negotiation balanced on gesture and assumption is where violence is born. A Norse axe is not just a tool, it is a symbol of threat. Just as a sudden gathering of indigenous hunters is not just a meeting, but a potential encirclement. And in a land where neither side understands the other's rules, restraint requires constant effort. Leif, as leader, understands this better than most, and his authority rests not on conquest, but on caution, on the knowledge that one violent incident could turn this place from opportunity to graveyard. But leadership does not eliminate tension, it merely contains it. And as winter deepens, tempers shorten, isolation weighs heavier, and the subtle pressures of survival begin to fracture the fragile unity of the group. These men are not warriors on campaign, they are settlers testing a possibility. And settlers carry fear differently, because there is no glory in retreat, only loss. Greenland looms in their minds not as home, but as necessity, a place they left because it was failing them. And the thought of returning empty-handed, without timber, without proof that Vinland can be used, feels like admitting defeat not just of a voyage, but of an entire way of life pushed westward by necessity. Yet the land does not bend to their needs. Storms batter the coast, ice threatens ships pulled onto shore, and the vast forests that promised safety now feel like walls closing in, hiding movement, hiding watches. And whether or not they are truly watched matters less than the belief that they might be, because fear alters behavior, and altered behavior alters outcomes. Somewhere beyond the trees live people who understand this place far better than the Norse ever will, people whose ancestors have adapted to these winters over generations, whose survival does not depend on returning east across an ocean, and that imbalance grows sharper with every passing day. When spring finally loosens winter's grip, it does not bring relief so much as exposure, because movement returns to the land, and with it encounters become more frequent and less controlled, misunderstanding sharper, patience thinner, and it is here, in this fragile season of thaw, that the Norse learn the most dangerous lesson of all. Iron does not guarantee dominance when numbers, mobility, and terrain belong to someone else. Accounts hint at skirmishes, at sudden violence erupting from moments that should have remained cautious, and whether sparked by theft, fear, or simple misreading of intent, the result is the same. The illusion of safety shatters, and Vinland reveals itself not as an empty frontier, but as contested ground. Leif's men, trained to fight, capable of brutality, nevertheless find themselves constrained by distance, by limited numbers, by the reality that every loss here is irreplaceable. And each confrontation leaves them more aware that this land will never be theirs in the way Iceland or Greenland could be, because ownership here would require something the Norse do not possess in sufficient measure: permanence. To hold Vinland would require families, reinforcements, sustained supply lines, and above all, a willingness to commit generations to a place that has already shown resistance, and Leif understands that such commitment is impossible. Because the Norse world is stretched thin, pulled between fragile settlements that barely sustain themselves, and the idea of defending a distant outpost across an ocean becomes less an ambition than a liability. The decision forming in Leif's mind is not sudden nor dramatic. It is slow, heavy, and deeply personal, shaped by every cracked timber, every wary glance toward the forest, every reminder that survival here depends on strength not alone, but on restraint. And restraint, in the long run, favors those who already belong. As summer advances and the brief northern warmth returns, the Norse prepare ships not for expansion, but for departure. Cutting timber not to build homes, but to carry back east, proof that the voyage was not wasted, that Vinland can still serve a purpose even if it cannot be held. And in this quiet shift from settlement to extraction lies the true meaning of failure, not defeat in battle, but recognition of limits. Leif Erikson, standing once more at the shoreline, watching the sun hang low even at dusk, understands that history will remember this moment incorrectly, that future generations will imagine bold conquest and lost empires, when the reality is far more human and far more restrained. A calculated withdrawal made by people who understood that some victories cost too much. And as the longships are prepared to leave, the question no longer haunting Vinland, but following them eastward, is not why the Vikings came, but after reaching America centuries before Columbus, why they chose to walk away. Leaving behind not ruins of conquest, but the quiet evidence of a decision made in survival's name, a decision that will echo through history precisely because it was never shouted. After the ships turn east and Vinland slips back into the fog, what remains is not merely empty land, but a wound in memory. Because the Norse do not speak of failure easily, and so the story of America becomes something quieter, something conditional, a place that exists but should not be pursued. And in Greenland and Iceland, where survival already balances on the edge of each season, that distinction matters more than any tale of heroism. The timber brought back from the West is used, traded, and slowly consumed, its origins fading into anecdote, while the deeper lesson of Vinland, its resistance, its cost, settles into the collective understanding of Norse society, shaping decisions without ever becoming doctrine. Greenland's settlements, never strong, grow more fragile as decades pass, the climate cooling, trade routes thinning, and the old logic of westward expansion reversing itself, because now the frontier offers not relief, but risk. The Norse world, once defined by outward movement, begins to turn inward, and the shift is not sudden or dramatic, it unfolds quietly, carried by changing priorities, by kings consolidating power in Scandinavia, by Christianity imposing new structures of authority and obligation, and by a growing sense that stability, however limited, is preferable to endless uncertainty. Vinland, in this new context, becomes an anomaly, a story that does not fit the emerging shape of Europe, and stories that do not fit are often left untold. The sagas preserve fragments, names, journeys, moments of contact and conflict, but they do so without urgency, without the insistence that this place must be reclaimed, because the men who experienced it firsthand understood that what lay beyond the Western Ocean was not a land waiting to be taken, but a land that demanded a price too high for a society already stretched thin.
As years pass, those who remember Vinland die, and those who hear of it secondhand hear it filtered through caution, through the unspoken knowledge that no great future came from that direction, and in the absence of success, interest fades. This is how frontiers truly close, not with walls or defeat, but with indifference. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, life continues uninterrupted, indigenous communities adapting, hunting, trading, and moving through landscapes that briefly felt the presence of outsiders and then absorbed their absence. Because for them, the Norse were not the beginning of a new era. They were a momentary disruption, dangerous but contained, another reminder that threats could come from unexpected directions but did not necessarily define the future. The land itself erases the evidence quickly. Turf walls collapse, iron rusts, wood returns to soil, and within a generation, Vinland bears little sign of Europe's arrival, reinforcing the illusion from across the ocean that nothing of lasting importance ever happened there. In Scandinavia, attention shifts toward internal struggles, toward the consolidation of kingdoms, toward religious transformation that reshapes law, identity, and allegiance, and the Atlantic, once a corridor of movement, becomes a boundary again, wide and psychologically closed, not because it cannot be crossed, but because there is no longer a reason compelling enough to risk it. Greenland's colonies begin their own slow decline, cut off by worsening climate and diminishing trade, and as they weaken, the idea of pushing even farther west becomes unthinkable, because expansion requires surplus, and surplus has vanished. Vinland's true legacy, then, is not what it gave, but what it taught, a lesson in limits that runs counter to the popular image of Viking fearlessness, revealing instead a society capable of restraint, of recognizing when persistence becomes folly. This restraint is not celebrated in song or monument, but it shapes history just as decisively as conquest, because by stepping back, the Norse allow the Atlantic to become, once more, a barrier between worlds, and that barrier will hold for centuries. When Europe eventually looks west again, it will do so from a fundamentally different place, technologically, politically, and psychologically transformed. No longer a patchwork of survival-driven communities, but a set of emerging states hungry for wealth, land, and prestige on a scale the Norse world never pursued. The silence left by Vinland makes that later return possible, because there is no memory strong enough to warn of what lies beyond the shore, no inherited caution embedded in policy or belief, only a blank space on the map waiting to be filled. And so Vinland slips into legend, into marginal notes and half-remembered stories, its reality preserved not through influence but through obscurity, until centuries later, when archaeology will peel back the earth and reveal that Europe had once stood here before, had tested the land, and had chosen, deliberately, to walk away. That choice, invisible for generations, becomes the hinge on which the future turns, because history is not shaped only by what people do, but by what they decide not to pursue. And in leaving Vinland behind, the Vikings unknowingly set the stage for a very different encounter between Europe and America, one defined not by cautious withdrawal, but by relentless return.
For nearly 500 years after Vinland fades from living memory, the Atlantic becomes not a bridge, but a silence. And that silence reshapes both sides of the ocean in ways the Vikings could never have imagined. Because absence has consequences just as presence does, and the decision to leave North America untouched allows two worlds to continue evolving apart, unaware of how close they once came to permanent contact. In Europe, the centuries following the Viking retreat are marked by consolidation rather than exploration, as kingdoms hardened their borders, monarchs centralized power, and the Catholic Church weaves spiritual authority into political control, binding societies inward instead of pushing them outward. And the restless energy that once drove Norse ships across unknown seas is redirected into wars of succession, crusades, and internal reform.
The shipbuilders of Scandinavia perfect vessels for trade and regional warfare rather than transoceanic risk. Navigational knowledge narrows instead of expands, and the memory of sailing west beyond Greenland becomes increasingly abstract, detached from lived experience, until it exists only as saga, a story told without urgency because it carries no promise of return. Greenland itself, the last stepping stone between worlds, weakens steadily, climate cooling into the early stages of what we now call the Little Ice Age, ice choking harbors, trade ships arriving less often, iron and timber growing scarce, and as conditions deteriorate, survival becomes an inward struggle once again, leaving no surplus of people or resources to fuel renewed ambition. By the time Greenland's Norse settlements disappear entirely in the 15th century, the final living link to Vinland is gone, and with it vanishes the last practical memory of America as a reachable place. On the other side of the Atlantic, indigenous civilizations continue along paths shaped by their own environments and histories, developing complex trade networks, social structures, and spiritual systems without interference from Europe. And the brief Viking encounters leave no lasting scar because they were too limited, too restrained to reshape the continent. A reminder that history's most dramatic outcomes are not inevitable, but contingent on scale and persistence. This long separation matters because when Europe finally returns westward in the late 15th century, it does so armed not just with ships, but with a radically different mindset, driven by mercantile capitalism, state sponsorship, and a hunger for resources that dwarfs anything the Norse world ever possessed. The men who sail under Iberian flags are not farmers seeking land to survive. They are agents of kingdoms seeking profit, power, and prestige, backed by institutions capable of sustaining failure after failure until success is forced into existence. When Christopher Columbus crosses the Atlantic in 1492, he does so believing he has reached Asia, not knowing that Europeans stood on American soil centuries earlier. And that ignorance is crucial because it allows his voyage to be framed as unprecedented, as discovery rather than return, erasing the cautionary lesson Vinland once offered. Without memory of Norse restraint, Europe approaches the Americas not as a land to be tested cautiously, but as a prize to be claimed aggressively, and the difference in outcome is staggering. Where the Vikings arrived with dozens, later Europeans arrived with hundreds, then thousands, then entire systems of colonization, backed by gunpowder, disease, and political will, overwhelming indigenous societies through sustained pressure rather than immediate dominance. In this contrast lies the true significance of the Viking failure, because it reveals that technology and courage alone do not determine history. Timing does, scale does, and above all, intention does. The Norse came seeking survival and resources, and when the cost outweighed the benefit, they withdrew, preserving their world at the expense of opportunity, while later Europeans come seeking transformation, willing to absorb catastrophic loss in pursuit of long-term gain. The Atlantic silence, broken only by fishing voyages and rumor, ensures that when contact is renewed, it is not cautious, not negotiated, and not limited, but relentless, and the consequences ripple outward for centuries. Archaeology, when it finally uncovers Meadows in the 20th century, forces a re-evaluation of this history, confirming that the Vikings were not myths or exaggerations, but real people who reached America and made a deliberate choice to leave. And that choice reframes the narrative of exploration itself, shifting it away from inevitability and toward decision. Vinland's story becomes not a tale of what Europe could not do, but of what it chose not to pursue under the conditions of its time, a reminder that history is shaped as much by restraint as by ambition. And in that restraint lies a haunting counterfactual, because had the Vikings possessed stronger states, deeper populations, or a cultural drive toward conquest rather than survival, the story of the Americas might have begun 5 centuries earlier, under very different terms, altering languages, borders, and identities beyond recognition.
Instead, the Vikings step back into history's shadows, leaving behind a continent that remains unknown to Europe and a lesson unlearned, that some lands cannot be taken by courage alone, and that the cost of staying can outweigh the glory of arrival.
By the time the modern world rediscovers Vinland, the Vikings themselves have already been transformed into legend, recast as symbols of unstoppable force and fearless expansion. And it is precisely that myth which makes the truth of their withdrawal from America so difficult to accept, because myths prefer victory to judgment and conquest to restraint. For centuries, European scholars dismissed the sagas as exaggeration, half history tangled with fantasy, tales of strange lands and wild grapes treated as metaphor rather than memory, and in doing so, they unknowingly mirror the very indifference that once closed the Atlantic. Because to believe the Vikings reached America first would require acknowledging that discovery does not guarantee dominance. It is only in the 20th century, when spades cut into the soil of Newfoundland and uncover the unmistakable outline of Norse turf walls, iron nails, and worked timber, that the silence finally breaks and the past asserts itself with uncomfortable clarity. Meadows is not grand, not imposing, not the ruin of a lost empire, but that is precisely its power, because it reveals Vinland as it truly was, a practical, cautious foothold rather than a triumphant conquest, a place designed to function, not to impress. Archaeology confirms what the sagas implied but never emphasized. This was a temporary presence, carefully constructed and easily abandoned, and in that design lies intent. The Vikings did not fail because they were driven out in a single decisive defeat. They failed because the conditions required for success never aligned. And once that reality became clear, they chose survival over stubbornness. This realization forces a broader reassessment of Viking identity itself, shifting it away from caricature and toward complexity, revealing a society capable of strategic withdrawal, of recognizing limits imposed by geography, logistics, and demography. The Norse world, often remembered only for raids and violence, is exposed here as deeply pragmatic, governed by cost-benefit calculations rooted in experience rather than ideology. Vinland becomes evidence not of weakness, but of discernment, a reminder that the same people who could burn cities and terrify coasts could also decide, collectively, that a prize was not worth the price. Yet this nuance sits uneasily with modern expectations because we are conditioned to believe that history moves forward through escalation, that once a boundary is crossed, it cannot be uncrossed, and Vinland challenges that belief directly. It shows us a moment when history hesitated, when momentum reversed, and when restraint altered the future more profoundly than conquest would have. The indigenous peoples who encountered the Norse, whose ancestors would later face far more devastating invasions, unknowingly benefit from this restraint. Their worlds allowed to continue uninterrupted for centuries longer, their cultures spared the early arrival of diseases, displacement, and systemic collapse that would follow later European expansion. This does not make Vinland a story of harmony or moral triumph, but it does make it a story of scale, of how limited contact produces limited damage, and how escalation, not encounter itself, is what reshapes civilizations. In modern memory, the Vikings are often invoked as proof that Europeans were always destined to reach America, that Columbus merely followed in older footsteps. But this framing obscures the most important lesson of all, that destiny is not a straight line, and that reaching a place does not obligate history to follow through. Vinland existed. It was tested, and it was rejected, not because it lacked value, but because it demanded more than the Norse world could afford to give. And in that rejection lies a mirror held up to every empire that would come later, because the question the Vikings answered, quietly and without fanfare, is one that history keeps asking in louder and bloodier ways. How far is a society willing to go to hold what it has touched? The Norse answer, shaped by fragile settlements and limited populations, was cautious and humane by necessity, while later empires, armed with centralized power and ideological justification, would answer very differently, staying long after the cost became catastrophic. Vinland's rediscovery does not rewrite history so much as it deepens it, reminding us that the past is filled with unrealized futures, paths taken just far enough to be abandoned, and decisions made not in moments of triumph, but in moments of clarity. The Vikings met America, they measured it against their reality, and they chose to leave. And in that choice, rarely acknowledged and often misunderstood, lies one of the most revealing episodes of human expansion ever recorded, because it shows us that sometimes the most consequential act is not arrival, but restraint, and that the silence left behind can shape centuries as powerfully as any conquest.